Good morning, and thank you for joining today's webinar, The ABCs of BCP, Business Continuity Planning. I'm Megan Turco, and I will be your moderator for today. Before we jump in, I'm going to briefly go over how to use the webinar console. The orange arrow on the right side of your screen will let you toggle your control tray open or closed. And at the bottom of the control tray, you'll see a chat window. Please feel free to submit your questions at any time throughout today's webinar via the chat function, and we'll have a Q&A session towards the end. For your audio settings, on your GoToWebinar console, you should see an area for audio settings. If you're calling through your telephone, please choose the Use Telephone option. Alternatively, if you're using your computer speakers, please select the Use Mic and Speakers option. Additionally, I do want to mention that this webinar is being recorded, so we'll be able to send out our slides as well as a link to the on-demand recording within about 48 hours. So please keep an eye out for that email if you're interested in accessing the webinar after today. And a few reminders for CE. If you're utilizing this webinar for CE credits, you must respond to 75% of the polls and stay on the webinar for 50 consecutive minutes. You must use a personal computer, no PDAs, and log in with your own information and unique URL. And of course, like I mentioned, 50 consecutive minutes within the scheduled time frame of the webinar. And you must complete the evaluation at the end of the webinar as well. So I'll go ahead and introduce today's featured speakers. We have Jeremy Sucharski, who's one of our partners here at Armanino. Jeremy has over 15 years of experience in audit and consulting with a strong focus on SOX, SOC audits, and information security consulting. Jeremy leads the Governance, Risk, and Compliance, or the GRC team, and SOC audit practices here at Armanino. Prior to joining Armanino, Jeremy worked in the Deloitte ERS practice, focusing in IT internal audit, and spent several years with the federal government in various finance and IT-related positions. We also have Steve Schaffner with us today, who is a senior manager on our Governance, Risk, and Compliance team. Steve is a senior manager here at GRC, and he has over 16 years of experience performing various types of IT, governance, risk, and compliance audits. So we'll go through some of the learning objectives before we get started. During today's webinar, participants will identify the difference between business continuity planning and disaster recovery planning, enumerate the steps companies can take to implement a disaster recovery plan, ensure successful deployment and maintenance of a disaster recovery plan. And now I will go ahead and hand it over to Steve to get our presentation started.
Thanks, Megan. So just to build on the high-level outline you just gave us, let's drill down a little bit deeper. So we're going to define what is a disaster, and I think that's an important first step. Talk a little bit about why you should plan for disaster. We'll talk about planning approaches, including cloud considerations, which is certainly a growing consideration in our market today. Then we'll talk about testing and continuous improvement, talk about trends in this area, and we'll also talk about audit considerations for those of you who are joining us from that perspective. So let's start by defining disasters. According to Merriam-Webster, a disaster is a sudden calamitous event that brings great damage, loss, or destruction. And what we've done with this slide is giving you some different bullets of different types of disasters. So there's natural and man-made, and then there's that third bucket, which some would argue go in one of the others, usually man-made. Natural disasters, you can see what we have here. Most people think of earthquakes, floods, hurricanes, the things that we see in the news. Man-made are sometimes things that are overlooked, so riots, war, terrorism. These can have a devastating effect on your business just as much as an earthquake or anything else. And on the technological side, the way business has evolved, we all rely on information technology, computers and cash registers and all this automated stuff. And it's all very susceptible to hacking, viruses, worms, hardware failures, other things. That can have just as big an impact on your organization as the earthquake taking out that same set of resources. Disasters come in all sizes too. I think when most people think of disasters, they go to earthquakes and hurricanes and that type of thing, and you can see that on the right-hand side of this slide. But if you look in the middle on this one, it could be your server room burning down at your organization. Or on the smaller scale, it could be a hard drive that melted down or failed on you. Even taking it farther, it's not on this slide, but if you have a key database file that's somehow corrupted, that can take your system down just as much as any of the rest of these. So you have to think beyond just those natural disasters that we typically see in the news. So that said, why should we plan? And for that, I'll hand over to Jeremy.
Fantastic. And you're right, Steve, a lot of the time people have this mindset of, sort of acts of God, major disasters that are forces of nature, things of that sort. But really DR and business continuity planning focus on a variety of aspects. And really, if you look at it, at the end of the day, disaster recovery is going to be very focused on IT systems and making sure that you have the appropriate availability. Now, if you look at this, there's the three top causes of system outages are listed here. The first one is one that a lot of us don't necessarily see on a day-to-day basis because our IT teams handle this sort of in the background for most well-run organizations. I'll tell you, working with an organization in the past that had a major issue stemming from the first one here. They were going through an outage window, meaning with scheduled downtime. They were applying some updates to some of their infrastructure, specifically to their SAN, to their storage area network. And in applying this patch, it inadvertently caused some issues with the Windows servers in their environment as well as their Cisco call managers and took down all email as well as voice communications for 3 days. And it took them 3 days to recover to get back to the previous state of their environment. So major issue just from going about their seemingly normal course of business. Now, on the flip side, you can look at power failure. It's the second most common issue. For those of us in the Bay Area here, we were hit with Stormageddon last week. With a major storm blowing in 400 miles wide. Oh my gosh, there's going to be floods and trees toppling down, and it definitely was a big storm. But you saw, especially in downtown San Francisco, a lot of power failures causes major disruptions. You could look at it and say, well, gosh, we've got redundancy and resiliency in how we work because we have laptops, et cetera. And I would argue that's fantastic as long as you have laptop batteries. But really, what can you get done these days without being connected to the internet, without being able to email, phone call, access corporate systems that reside, whether it be in the cloud or in your corporate data center? So not having power and specifically not having access to your network if power is out is significant. And then not surprisingly, third would be fire. And that's primarily because not only do you get, heat damage, but also smoke damage can damage sensitive IT equipment as well in your data center or in your facility, physical location, et cetera. The one that actually is a close fourth is water damage as well, primarily because if you have water damage, the water needs to be shut off to the building most commonly when you're making those updates, changes, et cetera. And the health department will not allow you to occupy a building for an extended period of time, if there is no water for an extended period of time, primarily because of sanitation. So significant issues, and you really need to be looking at these and taking these into account as we move on, as you move through the DR and the planning process. Now with that, let's go ahead and pause momentarily, and let's get to our first polling question here.
So coming up on your screen, you should be able to see our poll question here. And the first one is, what is the average cost of an unplanned outage? A, $11,200, B, $52,500, C, $104,350, or D, $287,000. So go ahead and please submit your answers here. And it looks like we actually have a number of people already putting in their answers, so we'll give everyone just a few more seconds. Looks like we have almost everyone in, so we'll go ahead and close the poll.
All right, and let's take a look at those answers here. All right, and the correct answer is D. Now it's interesting, a lot of the results came in as B or C, lower amounts, but not surprisingly, this is a significant area, and it's got significant dollars tied to it. And really, if you take a step back and think about how you would quantify this, think about your organization and how you derive not only revenue, so your downtime could be lost revenue, but also what are the expenses that you incur in terms of having to pay employees, not get productivity while they're idle, things of that sort, in addition to any type of expense you're going to expend recovering, whether it be IT, reoccupying your building, things of that sort. So as you start to look at all the different facets of your organization, you can see how this could tally up to be quite a significant dollar amount very, very quickly. So as we drill down, you might be asking yourself, saying, great, these are some good facts, Jeremy, good numbers, you've got my attention. Well, really, why do we need to have this? Why do we need to have a DR plan? Why do we need to have business continuity? The other thing I hear a lot of is, we're okay, I've got backups, which I think is a very sort of antiquated view of availability and disaster recovery specifically. Really what's driving a lot of this is, number one, you've got to have high availability for data. We absolutely have moved away from sort of the product economy that we historically have had in the United States. We're very much a knowledge economy, and with that comes data and the reliance on data. The system availability for your industry, for your company, for your vendors, your partners, your employees, et cetera, is significant. Along those lines as well, you could have regulatory requirements for uptime. I know when I was doing work previously at Visa, they had requirements with their customers, with their member banks, to be able to give an authorization reply in less than 6 seconds for every transaction that is submitted. And that feeds into not only customer requirements, but regulatory requirements as well. You've got contractual obligations. This is significant with companies that are operating in the cloud, whether it be software as a service, platform as a service, et cetera. We're going to talk more about that today. But you could have contractual obligations to make sure you're maintaining appropriate uptime and maintaining a business continuity plan so you can continue to operate and support your customers as well. And last but not least, it just makes good business sense. Really what it comes down to is there's the financial loss, and we talked about that, the average being 200 and almost 290,000. But there's also the reputational loss, not only for your customer, for you within the market, how your customers perceive you, but nobody wants to be in a leadership position going to their board explaining why you've had significant outages because you chose not to invest in this area. So really bottom line is it just makes good sense to do that at this point. So you might be saying, okay, great, you've got my ear even more, Jeremy. Well, really, what are other companies doing? And so if you look at some of the statistics that are widely available, you can see about 71% of companies have some form of DR, business resumption plan. I'll tell you, from being an IT auditor for quite some time now, my experience is that most of those plans are commonly on a shelf, gathering dust, not being used very much, which is a shame. And you see that, surprisingly, though, 60% almost were updated within the past year. I find that actually to be pretty surprising. But again, this is based on a relatively recent survey. And then the last one there, plans were tested within the last year. I think this one honestly is skewed. 82% seems exceptionally high to me. Really, I think this is skewed because the term tested provides a very wide latitude of interpretation. I think there's a lot of subjectivity. So you could be looking at, well, are you periodically testing a restore from your backup media, things like that. I know some organizations have that sort of misconception that simply testing a restore of your backups is sufficient for DR, but it really needs to go beyond that. So again, while the respondents to this survey indicated 82%, my personal take is that that's a little bit higher than what I commonly see within our client base and within organizations that we're working with on a day-to-day basis. Steve, any thoughts on any of those statistics?
Well, I think I agree with your comment about this being skewed. Even if you just look at the stats on the slide here, 71% of companies have a BCP, but 82% are testing them. I mean, what are the other 10% testing if they don't even have one, right? So, yeah, I definitely agree with your comments on that.
Yep, absolutely. All right, well, let's shift gears and let's go ahead and jump into our second polling question.
So it should be showing up on your screen here momentarily. Our question is, what percent for companies with a BCP go out of business after a disaster? 10% or less, 25 to 30%, 50 to 60%, or 90% or more. And just as a brief reminder, you must actively respond to at least 75% of our polls today to get your CE credits. So definitely make sure that you're participating in our polls. So we've got about 90%, so we'll give everyone just a few more seconds here. And I think we'll go ahead and close the poll and pass it back to Jeremy to debrief the answer.
Absolutely. And I apologize. I realize that we actually had that worded incorrectly, although everybody did answer it correctly based on the question. So we had worded as how many companies go out of business if they have a BCP plan, and the answer is 10% or less. On the reverse of that is what we're intending to ask, which is if you do not have a disaster recovery plan or business continuity plan, what percent of companies will go out of business? And the answer is 90. So either way you cut it, the majority of the respondents got the answer correct. And the reality is 90% of the time, if you have an issue, if you have an extended interruption, and you do not have a DR or BCP plan to execute and recover operations to a normal state within an acceptable time frame, 90% of companies will go out of business.
So wasn't there a time frame on this stat too? So it was
Yep.
like you go out of business within like 5 years or something. Or...
Yep, absolutely, and that is a perfect lead into the next slide, Steve. Thank
go.
you very much. It's almost like you and I have talked about this in the past. And you can see here, 90% of companies that can't recover operations within 5 days will go out of business within 1 year. And so you've got a little bit of latitude there, but 5 days, let's be honest, 5 days goes by pretty darn quick. And when you're looking at the various requests coming in, et cetera, for how you would recover, really the key benefit that comes from having a DR or a BCP in place is it's your playbook. You're not having to make it up as you go. So as management and as IT and the business fields requests from customers, employees, et cetera, complaints about what needs to get done, questions, et cetera, you have the playbook to go execute against those things that are most important, and it'll help you meet that 5 day or less window to ensure you don't fall into the statistic of being in the 90%. It's definitely a 90% you do not want to be a part of. So we've talked about some of the basics, and let's start talking about how you would go about planning and really what goes into a successful plan and how you would go about executing that.
Yeah, so our next slide is intending to clarify a couple of terms that often get confused and mixed together. So you'll hear people talking about disaster recovery plans and also about business continuity plans. And a lot of people use those interchangeably. But when you really dig into it, there is a distinction between the two. And I think this is becoming clearer in the industry over time. So a disaster recovery plan, most people will agree, is successfully recovering your IT systems in the shortest time frame possible, right? So it's getting back to normal operations. And then a business continuity plan dovetails on top of that, that while you are recovering your operations, how will you continue your business in the absence of those key resources? So I know one thing I was thinking when you were talking a second ago, Jeremy, is this presentation is very focused on IT. And granted, that is a very big and important critical resource for most organizations. If your systems go down, that's obviously going to impact you. But there's other things as well that could impact you. The loss of a building, your shipping company, the loss of your drivers due to a strike. If you're a manufacturing company, the loss of a production line. Again, there's lots of things that you may have to plan around if they're absent. We're going to focus on IT on this call. All right. So business continuity planning fallacies. A lot of people, when they sit down and start planning, they're planning for a one-time event. And they execute this in a vacuum. It's only focused on IT. That kind of ties with what I was just saying. And they're looking for some type of absolute assurance. So basically, they're focused on an earthquake, and it's a one-time earthquake. It only affected IT. They're assuming all their staff are going to be available. They're going to assume that all their other resources are available to assist in these efforts. And the reality is, if you were planning for something large like an earthquake, that's a big regional event, and it's going to affect how your employees can or cannot get to work. It's going to affect the critical resources that you need to recover, the trucks to move stuff around, or the access to get to a store that has the equipment that you need. Those things may not be open or available. They may not be able to get to and from your location. And frankly, if it's a regional-wide event, everybody else is affected by the same thing, and they're all competing to get those resources. So there's a lot of other variables that sometimes can be overlooked if you take that approach. What you should be looking at is an ongoing process in your planning. You don't sit down in one shot, plan it all out, and you're done. As industry evolves, as your business evolves, you need to evolve your plan with them. should become part of your company culture. And the key as you're doing all this is to make sure that you are planning for reasonable assurance. You can kind of kill yourself if you go too far down the road with planning efforts and really spend more on the planning than you should, and we're going to talk about that on another slide in a second. You want to mitigate risks, and then of course you want to cover all critical company processes. So we're going to run through a planning process here in the next few slides that will talk a little bit more on how to do that smartly. First, let's talk about components of an effective business continuity planning cycle. So again, this is a process. It becomes part of your organizational culture, and this is a visual representation of that. It should start at the top with a risk assessment. So you need to look at your different business units, assess what risks could impact you. Then you do a business impact analysis and say, if those risks actually happened, how would that affect our business? With that information, then you can design a solution, implement the solution, we're at the bottom of the circle now, and then you can test and evaluate that implementation to see how well it's working. Based upon that, you're going to identify gaps and things that need to be improved, and then you make those revisions and start at the top again. For most organizations, this is typically an annual cycle that you go through. So we start with a risk assessment. And this gets back to that same slide we had earlier. Which types of things affect us as an organization? This slide has a good list of those, but if you dig around online or if you talk to whoever your advisor is, there are longer lists of things, and you know it's good to start with those and say which ones are applicable to us, which ones are not applicable to us. Give you an example. In California, earthquakes is definitely at the top of our list. That's probably why it ended up on the top of our list here. But hurricanes and droughts, sorry, those affect us. What's the other one I was thinking of? Twisters and tornadoes. Not that they don't happen here, but they're a lower risk. So you have to take that into account. And that leads us nicely to polling question number 3.
So we'll go ahead and get that launched here up on your screen. So our next question is, how many types of disasters should most companies plan to include in their planning efforts? Under 2, 4 to 6, 6 to 8, over 10, or none of the above? So we'll give everyone a few moments here to get their answers in. Everyone seems to be a little bit more all over the board on this one. We've got about 78% voted so far. And we'll go ahead and close the poll. And I'll pass it back over for the debrief.
Yeah, so this one was a kind of a trick question. Really, when you're planning for a disaster, what you want to plan for is the absence of your key resources, not necessarily what type of disaster caused them. So I think most companies will end up focusing primarily on probably in the 4 to 8 disaster range relative to whatever is applicable to you. That's going to depend on your industry, the type of company you are, your geography, a number of different factors. But again, the reality is you need to focus on the absence of resources. And that ties nicely to the next slide. One common planning pitfall that most companies do is they try to come up with a plan for an earthquake, and then they try to come up with a plan for a flood, and a plan for a riot, and a plan for et cetera, et cetera. You will drive yourself crazy and spend a ton of money trying to take that approach. Again, just as we were saying, focus on the absence of a key resource. If an earthquake takes out your building and your building is gone, you need to work on that. If a flood hits the building, same thing, etc.
And the way that I would argue to think about that is really focus on 3 things: your people, your process, and your technology, because that's going to help you really zero down. So in Steve's example, you don't have access to your building. Great. What are you going to do with your people? Do they have the ability to work remotely, etc.? Are they tied to their building? Steve's earlier example of losing a manufacturing line. Obviously, losing your building, losing that manufacturing line will have a major impact on your people. On the flip side, your technology. We've talked about disasters related to loss of system availability, things of that sort. Well, what is the likelihood of that occurring, and what would the impact be, et cetera? So if you really break it down and analyze it from those 3 key areas, it's going to help you zero in very quickly on what are those risks that are most key to your business, and leads right into the next piece of the planning process.
which is doing a business impact analysis. And you'll hear people refer to this often as a BIA. It's kind of a common acronym. So when you're doing the analysis, what you're doing is looking at your business and each key business unit that you have. For each business unit, what are the inputs, what are the processes that they perform, and then what are the outputs for that business unit. As you're doing that, you want to identify your key resources, and that ties to what Jeremy was just saying in terms of people, process, and technology. There's also some sub-bullets here that talk about, do you have peak seasons? You know, if you're a food, I'm trying to think of the right company for it. If you work in the food industry, and I know I had a client a while back that used to can tomato sauce. Sounds pretty basic, but it was pizza sauce in a very big industry, and they have a big annual season. So for 80 or 90% of the year, they had their systems go down. It wasn't such a big deal. But if it happened during the harvest, when all the trucks were coming in with these tomatoes and they had to do what they do with them, that was a very, very different scenario, and they had a very different response for that time of year.
I mean, and the flip side of that, too, is you think about the season we're in right now with the holidays and everything. I did all my Christmas shopping this morning at 7 in the morning when I got to the office because I could do it online, and I'm way behind. And if Nordstroms.com and jcrew.com and everything else, thankfully my wife's not on the line today, or she would know what she's getting. But if those systems were not available, obviously it would impact you know, my ability to transact with those organizations, and that's really, you know, across the board. If you look at retail as well, you know, to Steve's point, seasonality becomes a significant concern as part of your BIA process.
You know, and it's interesting too. I was watching the news this year, and on Black Friday, not only is that the day that most merchandise organizations, they turn the corner from being in the red and going to the black, but it also now is becoming the holiday of the year for hackers to hack into retailers' websites and take them down because they know it's going to have the biggest impact, it's going to get the biggest exposure. So yeah, definitely something to think about, and that gives a new risk to consider. Last year maybe it wasn't so much of a risk. Now it's becoming a popular thing in that circle. Now it's something you might have to think about. So there's one example of something that would need to change as our industry changes throughout the year, throughout time. All right, now once you've done that initial analysis, what are the inputs, processes, outputs, and then you've determined what resources support those, you want to then take that information and you can put it together into some stats that you can sort then and basically get down to what is the recovery time objective for each business unit and what is the recovery point objective. So basically this is saying what is going to be absent, how long can I be without it before it has a significant impact? And then with that information and the numerical scores tied to them, you can sort it, and that helps you set your priority for your planning efforts. So this slide kind of builds on something we've hinted at a couple of times. You can drive yourself crazy planning for everything under the sun, and there's obviously a cost for doing so. So what this chart shows, on the x-axis, we have the length of downtime or the absence of critical resource. And that's going to be relevant in a couple of different ways that I'll talk about in a second. On the y-axis, we have the cost of either mitigating the disaster or the cost of the disaster itself and the impact of the organization. This first line shows the impact of the organization relative to a disaster. So on the left-hand side of this, if you had a disaster for a few seconds, probably nobody would even notice. So there's no loss. But once you get to an hour or 2 hours, that's going to have a bigger impact on your organization. And there's very smart people that have done studies and shown that this line grows exponentially the longer you go from the start of a disaster event. So that's the loss that you can expect in relation to the time that you're down. Now on the flip side, you can mitigate disaster or the impact of a disaster. And the less downtime you can live with, the higher that cost is going to be, and this is also an exponential line that goes downwards. So basically on the left-hand side, I know Visa did some disaster work early in my career. They measured their impact of being down in terms of millions of dollars per second, and therefore they invest a lot in business continuity and disaster recovery. So their cost is quite high. They're on the left-hand side of this on the green line. Now, the longer your organization can go without having its critical resources, the lower the cost is to maintain that. So now what you get out of all of this is your target planning level. If you look at where these two lines intersect, that is the point that you should invest in to mitigate disaster that will be roughly equal to the amount you would lose if you experienced a disaster. And these are things that you and your organization, you can calculate these lines for you. It's a little scientific and a little bit of just noodling around with these things, but if you say, if we were down for a day, what's the impact and what's the loss to us? If we were down for a week, a month, etc. And then on the flip side, you can look at the cost to mitigate relative to those same time frames, and you can plot out these lines. Any thoughts on that, Jeremy, before I go on?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head, and really at the end of the day, the reason that this is so critical and important is a lot of organizations start at the wrong point. They'll say, hey, I need to go invest in triple redundancy, and I can only absorb 4 minutes of downtime, and I have to have replication, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, the reality is you might be able to absorb a week of downtime, but until you take a look at the impact of having your critical resources not in place and the associated costs, you're not going to find the appropriate balance, because the reality is you might be able to take and have 3 days of downtime and have a reasonable cost to recover versus having to invest significant dollars, effort, et cetera, to recover. So this is why it's of really critical importance, and a lot of the success or failure of your chosen strategy ultimately hinges on having this analysis done and done well.
Now, one common part of any plan is going to be what we like to call an umbrella part of the plan. So your specific plans on how you respond to the disaster, both in a disaster recovery sense and a business continuity sense, are going to vary. If you're a high-tech company, you're going to have one flavor of response. If you're a manufacturing company, a different flavor. If you're a food processing company, yet another flavor. But there's common elements regardless of which of those you are, and that's represented on this slide. So one thing you want to have identified in your plan is roles and responsibilities, and that's primarily for the disaster management team when we look at this from an umbrella perspective. The disaster management team is typically the executives of the organization, and these are the people that are going to perform what I like to call command and control functions. So they're going to walk through the steps, and those are in the sub-bullets here, as a team, and relative to the information they gather initially, they're going to guide the recovery or the continuity efforts. Then we get into the sub-bullets. So the first thing that they'll need to do is declare a disaster. If there's an earthquake, that's an easy thing to do, right? Hey, we just had a big earthquake. That was a disaster. Let's go. But there are some things that play out that aren't so obvious. So let's stick with our Black Friday example and say, hey, the systems are not behaving normally. We're having longer response times and latency and those types of things. It may not be obvious what's going on right away. At some point, somebody needs to declare the disaster. And that would be the executives typically. And this is similar to when there is a large regional disaster, the president has to come in and declare a disaster. What that does is that activates the plan formally. And there's a lot of additional funding that comes in and different protocols that we follow. So that's step one. Let's identify the disaster and formally communicate that out. Then we get into disaster management. And that's the command and control part that I was just talking about. Collecting statuses, communicating directions, etc. Along those lines, one of the first things that you'll need to do is assess the damage related to the event. How has this impacted us? What equipment can we salvage? And then with that information, you can start directing the recovery process and the continuity process. As that's going on, you want to also be getting back to normal. So that's your resumption at the primary site. And at the end of all this, this committee will declare a formal end to the disaster. And a more mature organization is also going to perform a postmortem, say, how did that go? How did this impact us? Was it in line with what we expected? How do we improve our plan? That's the last sub-bullet there. So we do better next time and we're better prepared. And then also that same committee outside of the disaster, they're responsible for the testing and the maintenance and Probably should add a couple words to that to say the awareness within the organization and preparedness within the organization. That's usually a product of the testing and the maintenance. When you have people doing those processes, you get the side benefit of them becoming aware and better prepared. So now I'll hand back off to Jeremy.
Yeah, absolutely. So as you drill down from kind of the umbrella plan, you're going to start to look at what are considerations specific to your disaster recovery plan. And Steve started to hit on some of these. You've done your analysis. You've determined what are your critical resources, what are the single points of failure, and you want to start thinking about your recovery strategy specific to locations. From a technology perspective, you can be looking at things like a hot site, a warm site, a cold site. I'll be honest, these are starting to become relatively antiquated sort of terms, primarily because of the push to the cloud. So many organizations now do not have their critical IT resources physically in-house, whether it's a private cloud or a public cloud or a hybrid. Most organizations have those, in the not in their physical buildings. The other thing is thinking about how you're going to handle. Again, we talked about it previously. People. Are you going to handle them locally? What about local versus geographic separation? What are the different things you need to be thinking about as you evaluate your organization and then define? So defining your recovery approach, forming your team, again, documenting your plan, ensuring it's communicated. Really at the end of the day, as I mentioned previously, you really want to break it down to a very simplistic level wherever possible. And for those of you who maybe are on the line, have either heard me speak before or have worked with me, I like to boil things down to just a handful of bullets. Key items, and it's really looking at what are the efforts around ensuring your technology can meet the defined RTOs and RPOs. What are the items that need to be in place to ensure your processes can be recovered and ensure that they're operating at the appropriate effectiveness? And last but not least, how do we train and educate everyone so they know once a disaster is declared what their responsibilities are to go ahead and execute from there? The other piece that you're also going to be looking to focus on as well is solution design specific to business continuity. And again, this is more where we look at the people side of the business, and I started to speak to this already. You're looking at if our people cannot operate in a normal way. While most of the world operates with laptops, not everybody does. If they cannot physically get to their workstations, if they cannot physically get to their place of business. And we saw this here in the Bay Area recently. And actually not just the Bay Area, but really across the country with some of the demonstrations around, sort of the follow-up from the Ferguson issues in Missouri, protests, et cetera. We saw that in Oakland, shutting down freeways, shutting down parts of downtown Oakland. We saw that in Berkeley, et cetera. So thinking about if it is an employee safety issue, should we be having individuals work remotely, and can we support that? So those are things to evaluate as part of your organization. And then from there, define what the communication process is, how individuals will be notified of these things. When I was working with at the federal government, it was shortly after the Oklahoma City bombing of the federal building there. And they used that as a trigger to revisit their business continuity planning processes and revisited how they communicate the process to know, should we be in the office for the day, should we be working remotely, what is it that we should be doing in the event of emergency, what are those response procedures. The other thing is, hey, what happens if we're shut down for 2 weeks? How are we going to handle that in terms of paying our employees, granting them leave, et cetera? What's the appropriate measure there? And defining what are the different recovery plans. It could be different department by department. It could be different office by office. It could be different geography by geography. But again, looking at sort of the people and the process side of the equation and designing the appropriate solution, folding that in underneath that larger sort of more holistic umbrella plan.
So let's focus now for a little bit about cloud applications. So for those of you who may not be familiar with what that is, it's basically when you host systems outside your organization. And it started initially with websites. So most companies had all of their systems. They had them in-house with their IT operations team supporting them. But oftentimes they would outsource their website. And the reason is it's on the internet, and therefore it's a target for hackers. And if you keep that separate from the rest of your organization, that helps protect you from that risk. But what's starting to happen is that we're outsourcing more and more of the systems that we rely on. Initially, the biggest adoption was around payroll and HR systems, and pretty much every company that we see these days does outsource their payroll to one of the big providers. Now what we're starting to see currently is that there's a move for ERP systems, which are your main financial or accounting systems, are also moving to the cloud. And there's a lot of benefits to this as to why. I mean, these companies that host, that's what they do. That's the core of their business, which is different than most other companies. We're an accounting firm, not necessarily an IT firm, so it makes sense for us to focus on accounting, which is our core business, and let a different organization focus on IT and IT support, which is the core of their business. So it's that type of mindset. When you outsource to the cloud, there's different terms out there that you'll see. One is infrastructure as a service. And basically what this diagram is showing is at the bottom layer, that's the hardware layer. They just provide you support for a box. The box lives at the vendor, but everything else that you do with that box in terms of the operating system and the tools and the software for the application and all the maintenance of that, that's still up to your organization. The next level is platform as a service. So this continues with that first piece, but then builds onto it that they may provide you with additional tools. They may have compilers, they may have middleware available to assist with interfaces, but the application is still your responsibility to install, maintain, etc. And then the most common that we see in the marketplace now is software as a service. So it's referred to as SaaS. And that basically is you typically go to a website and you're using the application that's supported by the vendor through a web page. So you're using a browser to interface with the application, and the vendor is taking care of everything. This is going to become important as we get into approaches for addressing this from a disaster and a business continuity perspective. The more you get towards the right of this diagram here, the more reliance you're placing on the vendor. Obviously, if you look on the infrastructure and the service side on the left, they're just providing you with the box itself, and you're doing the rest of the maintenance. So there's going to be less reliance on them, more reliance on your own organization. So now let's look at these two different approaches here. So the first one starts with infrastructure as a service and platform as a service, and this is from a BCP strategy. Here's your organization. You go through the network, and you get to your service provider. If the provider is down, well, that's obviously going to impact you, and you need to plan for that. Another thing to think of, though, is if the network is down, even if the provider is up, if they're up and you can't get to them, they're just as down as if they were down from your perspective, right? So you need to consider that option as well, and a common strategy for that is to have two different network paths to get to the provider. And obviously, if they're both down, that's an issue as well. If you have infrastructure as a service or platform as a service, that means that you are administering the application. And if that's happening, then you, because you are doing that, have the option of splitting that service between different cloud providers. And what that does is gives you redundancy. So if one of them is down, either this provider, the network, or both, you can switch to the other. Let me go back. Then you can switch to the other, and that's what this is showing here. So you're load balancing between the two. Then we have the other approach. This is for software as a service. And for these scenarios, remember, you're completely relying on the vendor. So here you are again. Here's the network again. There's the vendor, this time a SaaS vendor. If they go down, you're in trouble. Just as before, the network, you're in trouble. If they're both down, you're in trouble. And now from a BCP strategy, what do? Right? We don't have the option to go to a different provider because these providers, they don't like to share administration when they have everything in their house. So in that case, you are putting all of your eggs in one basket. So focus needs to be placed up front, meaning before you contract with the vendor, to make sure that they can support you in a disaster situation. And they also need to have some other assurances available to you, things like SOC reports, which are Service Organization Controls reports, that are independent audits of their ability to respond in these types of things. So there you go. Then you have one other twist on this just to consider. When you go to the cloud, here's your organization again. You go through the network again to get to the cloud provider. what you need to be aware of is sometimes they outsource to a data center provider. And the data center provider may also outsource support, meaning when you pick up the phone to call with a problem, who you talk to, they may outsource to somebody else. And frankly, they may have some software development that's also happening offshore. So when you're contracting with a cloud provider, in this diagram, that would be just the cloud piece here, you need to be asking questions about how much of their operation is under their control versus other vendors' control that they have hired, and take that into consideration. So in summary, from a cloud perspective, if you contracted for infrastructure or platform as a service, you have the option of doing the redundancy that we just talked about. But if you're in a SaaS service where the vendor is providing everything for you, you need to understand their environment, understand their disaster recovery and business continuity plans, and take steps to ensure their ongoing compliance. And when you're looking at their disaster recovery plans, there's the orange and red colored text here. You have to be aware, because most service level agreements with cloud providers, they'll have a guarantee about some level of uptime, and the common one is what they call 5 nines. It's 99.999% of uptime. I think that equates out to like 5 minutes a month that they might be down, which is, in the grand scheme of things, not a whole lot. And then they'll also have something in there that it's a force majeure clause or an act of God clause. And basically what that does is it gives them an out to say, we guarantee you this uptime, but if a disaster hits, that isn't under that same service level agreement. The other thing that I've seen are companies that say, we guarantee that 99.999% of the time will be up, but we may have, and it's usually a number, 3 times or 5 incidents, 3 to 5 incidents per whatever time period, where it may take longer to recover than our normal agreement. Now, and what that means is of all the different problems that they have, most of them are going to get responded to and meet that 99.999%. But that one time, they might be down for 6 months, right? And that's what's kind of baked into these clauses. So really have a good, detailed discussion with the vendors before you contract with them. Make sure you understand how they're going to be responding in a time of disaster, not just the normal uptime service levels that they agree to. And now I will hand back over to Jeremy.
Yep, absolutely. And so, other things to think about. We've gone through various scenarios here and given input on how you can consider scenarios. Whether it be the planning process, the risk assessment process, et cetera. Things you need to think about as you're working to finalize your plans, put those in place is, we talked at the onset about what are the way to approach this is, what if critical resources are not available? So the other piece that you have to consider as well is what happens if the people executing the plan are not there, are not available? You need to make sure that you've got individuals have the appropriate decision-making and spending authority, and are part of the plan, et cetera, and that you've got secondary and tertiary options on those, making sure that communications and infrastructure for the region are going to be functioning, and if not, how you have secondary and tertiary options to ensure that you're actually being able to work through the execution of the plan. And these are really critical items to ensure that your plan is, in fact, one that can be used in the event it is called on.
And I think the key on that last slide is the escalation plan. Let's say Bob is in charge of a certain area. Well, we're going to reach out to Bob, but we don't know if Bob is impacted by the disaster, Bob is away on vacation. Maybe Bob is fine, but his cell phone's battery's dead or something.
Yep.
But we can only wait so long for Bob to respond to our call, and after that we got to go to Sally or whoever the next person is.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly, and that feeds into the next point here, which is the procedure should be written at a sufficient level of detail that an educated person or an individual with the appropriate expertise could step in and execute those plans. So we're not going to pull somebody off the factory line and expect them to go ahead and rebuild a firewall for me. That's not necessarily reasonable. But we should have, for an individual with relevant skills, knowledge, and experience, we should be able to plug them in with those recovery procedures and be successful. And also looking at it as, do we need to recover everything, or do we only need to recover a portion of the system to get rolling, then the rest can be done. And then also recognizing and communicating that there's going to be, as part of this recovery process, likely will be a decrease in performance. Things aren't going to run at an optimal level.